This is the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, episode 707, 10 Trauma-Informed Principles for Educators During the Coronavirus, with Dr. Eric Rossen. Welcome to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, hosted by author, educator, speaker, and mom, the Cool Cat teacher, Vicki Davis. Students, along with teachers and parents, are experiencing residual effects from the trauma related to the coronavirus crisis. In today's show, Dr. Eric Rossen shares 10 principles to help us encourage and help others as we work through this crisis together. It's always a real eye-opener when Eric joins us. He's a national certified school psychologist, a licensed psychologist in Maryland, and a credentialed National Register Health Service psychologist. He currently serves as the Director of Professional Development and Standards for the National Association of School Psychologists. His most recent project is editing a publication called Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students, a Guide for School-Based Professionals, 2nd edition. Now we have a lot to learn. Let's check in with Vicki and Eric now. Enjoy!
I want to thank Impero for sponsoring today's show. They've just launched Impero Backdrop, a completely free tool that helps schools prioritize student mental health and keep students safe during in-person and remote learning. Stay tuned to the end of the show to learn more. Today, our goal is to update the conversations and the evidence about mental health as we continue to progress and help our students through the pandemic. No better guest that we could think of to bring back on the show except for Dr. Eric Rossen. He's currently the Director of Professional Development and Standards with the National Association of School Psychologists. They have a fantastic COVID19 Resource Center. And he's most recently the editor of Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students, a Guide for School-Based Professionals, the 2nd edition. So, Eric, we're going to examine some of the evidence. What are you finding as you look at the research that's happened? You know, school has changed in March 2020. What are you finding?
Right. Well, so much has happened, but a lot of the research is starting to really dive into what are the mental health and behavioral health impacts on families and students. And a recent study that was published just in October in Pediatrics found that over a quarter of parents reported worsening mental health for themselves, and 14% reported worsening symptoms for their kids. Now, if you break that down further, parents are systematically inaccurate when they estimate the mental health challenges of their children. I'm a parent myself, so that's a hard pill to swallow. But parents regularly underestimate their own kids' struggles. And this has been shown consistently in research. So I'd venture to say those challenges are even more significant. But the same study also found that things like food insecurity has increased, employer-sponsored insurance coverage has decreased, access to childcare has decreased. So there are a number of systematic stressors that are impacting mental health. Then you take that even further, and there's evidence related to increases in domestic abuse, in child maltreatment. One example was just by the end of March, so this is at the very beginning, the National Sexual Abuse Hotline had 22% more calls, and half of those calls were coming from minors, and that was just in March. So you have this ongoing potential for a range of risk factors and chronic pressure put on by multiple layers of adversity for many of our students and families.
Now, I know that you're in Maryland, so your kids are learning from home. I'm in a school that has been fortunate enough to be in person for 11 weeks, but I hear things that people say, like, for example, if we can save one life, we should all just stay at home until we can get this thing handled. Now, we don't want to debate, which is more important, physical health or mental health, because ideally we're going to have to balance both of those things. But how can we understand the significance of the mental health issues and help educators understand this is a factor we have to consider?
Well, it's a great question. It's something where schools are ideally engaging with the community, having an understanding of the context, engaging with the families and the students, and regularly assessing the context and what the needs are. You raise a great point, though. It's certainly not my place to say what's better in a particular community or not. But what I can do is highlight, a few key components for schools to pay attention to when it comes to the mental and behavioral health and well-being of students and their families. School is a critical source of stability and a central access point for care. So there's evidence that among students that receive mental health support, 70 to 80% of them get them at the school first. And if they get them in the school, they're more likely to seek further supports in the community. So we need to ensure that students have access to school-employed mental health professionals, like school psychologists or school social workers or school counselors, that understand the learning and mental health within the educational context. I think one of the challenges, of course, is when you're virtual, some people are less clear on how to access those supports. When you're in person, the student could walk into that person's office. They see them. There's organic interaction. And so, of course, schools need to be sure that not only is that access there, but it's communicated to families and students on how to actually reach those individuals.
I had a student come in the other day during break and just stand at my desk. And I just looked at this student and said, you want to talk, don't you? And she said, yes, I do. And then was able to talk about something that she really wanted to get off her chest. And she actually wanted her parents to know. And so it turned out very well that we could help that student. But, for me personally, whether it's here at my school or just in my life outside of school, I'm seeing a lot of kids who have issues and are grappling with wanting to talk about things. So even as a teacher, I think just being sensitive to the fact that kids, they don't know how to process some things, do they?
Absolutely. I mean, students regularly need access to good relationships with caring adults that have unconditional positive regard for them, this no strings attached relationship. And a lot of times, parents underestimate the struggles of their own children. It's because many times children don't want to go to their parents for certain things, right? They want to talk to someone else. They want to talk to their peers or maybe an adult in the school. One of the challenges, though, with the situation you described is the lack of opportunity to have trusting relationships with the school-employed mental health professionals that otherwise they might be familiar with. And so sometimes it's placing another, I don't want to say burden, but another responsibility on many of our classroom teachers and educators that are already burdened significantly with change in their job structure and function.
Well, compassion fatigue is real.
Yes, absolutely.
So what's next? What's your next point for what we need to consider as we try to work through this?
Well, a big component is ensuring our staff feel supported and cared for, that there are structured and unstructured opportunities to support one another, that our school systems enable them to prioritize their own well-being. It's one thing to talk about self-care, but it's another thing to ensure that our school systems as a whole have structures in place that enable teachers to care for themselves. They are making that a priority. Students often look to the adults around them to gauge the context. This is called social referencing, this idea where, and again, the example which I always give is if you're in a plane and there's turbulence, you look to the flight attendant. If they're still serving drinks, you're like, okay, it should be fine. If they're in the back strapping up and looking panicked, you know that it's time to panic. And so a lot of times students are looking for the cues of the adults around us. And if we're not making sure the adults are well and feel cared for and supported, we're hurting our students.
Adults are having longer hours. A lot are having to digitize their curriculum, which was largely paper-based, try to reach every child, not supposed to count anything late. Some have their own health issues and are concerned about, interacting with children. So how do you have a structure? Because, there's teachers that say, if I get this or if I get in quarantine once, I'm out of sick days.
Yeah, well, there are many things out there when it comes to staff well-being and a number of strategies that create a sense of community. There's a lot of research that just access to peer support, being able to talk to other staff and administrators without fear of retribution about struggles and stress, destigmatizing the stress that's going on can have a huge impact. Things like access to mentorship or induction, especially for new teachers, right? People in their first or second year, and this is their first experience. Having virtual or in-person gratitude walls and shout out walls where people can acknowledge each other and show gratitude to each other. I often highly recommend even award ceremonies for each other. I always say, actors and actresses get 6 award shows for themselves a year, and we don't reward and acknowledge each other enough. And just opportunities for staff to know and like each other, which is harder now because there's less opportunity to sit together and laugh and joke. So in a lot of ways, we have to be more purposeful and proactive about those opportunities.
I love that. I went out Friday, a coworker of mine, we had a ball game. We're doing intramurals. We're not competing against other schools right now. But we went to dinner at a place where we could have a big, long 6-foot table, and we just took off our masks and ate dinner together. And it was just such a beautiful, awesome moment. And it's just when you compare notes and you realize you're both struggling and doing well, but struggling with a lot of things, it just makes you feel better to have that companion in the struggle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. My grandmother had this great saying. She always said, pain shared is halved, joy shared is doubled. And basically, it is a statement about the value and critical nature of strong relationships, that they buffer the challenges and they accentuate the joys in our lives. And so, right now, it can be so isolating. And so those relationships, and for teachers, and again, this is back to, the idea that we're supporting kids' mental health by ensuring our teachers' mental health is valued.
What's your third?
So the third is when we're talking about providing valuable and effective mental and behavioral health services. It can be done virtually too, but it requires flexibility and adaptation and utilizing a lot of the resources we have. One of the biggest components is a focus on relationship building. And so ideally, and I think many schools are doing this well, but making sure that the students know what supports are available, getting to know who they are, what they look like, how to access those supports. There are places where, the school psychologist and the school social worker and the school counselor are going together and they're dropping into classrooms briefly, saying hi, teaching a social emotional skills lesson. So students know this is a support that's available to me. And when I need it, I know who that person is. I know what they look like. And I feel more comfortable pursuing that support. I wouldn't say I'm a foremost expert in telehealth services, but there's a lot of evidence that telehealth services being delivered over the internet can actually be really effective. And so there are many people who are downplaying the value of that, but it can be really helpful for students.
Love that. What's our fourth?
The fourth, and this is reiterating what we said about teachers, but again, as we know, many of the students' challenges are a reflection of the challenges of the adults around them. And so schools and school employee mental health professionals can play a significant role in supporting families, which in turn helps kids. And I think we need to be thoughtful about our methods of family engagement and family communication, regularly seeking input from families. I think this is especially critical for families with children with disabilities. And the special education process can be extremely overwhelming when it's done virtually or even in this context face-to-face. So being very thoughtful about how are we reaching families that are also stressed? As I mentioned from the research before, parents are feeling more stressed, their insurance coverage is lower, some food insecurity, a range of other issues. And so how are we ensuring they are supported and then similarly feel like they are not isolated, that we have their back, that we are in this together?
Probably can't really have face-to-face conversations, but I've always kind of had a rule that if it's a challenging conversation, I never do it over email. I always do it over the phone or face-to-face, preferably, because you can see the face, voice, and body language. They can see I'm not a threat, that we're on the same page. And, I think that the temptation to put all those conversations into email is creating some pretty inflammatory situations between parents and teachers, because email is notoriously awful for having difficult conversations. You just can't get enough in there, and there's so many barriers to that conversation. So just supporting parents by saying, hey, you know what? Not every parent actually checks their email. Some of them have even forgotten their passwords. I mean, you can go for weeks and say, why aren't they getting back up with me? And you think, you've offended them or they're mad at you. And then they say, hey, I lost my phone, when you pick up the phone and call them. Or, hey, I can't access my email. I forgot my password. I have a new email. Those things do happen. You have any thoughts on the way to communicate challenging situations? I mean, is email the best way to do that, or what do you think?
I agree with you. Email is not great, and a lot of times it relies on relationships. And so again, I'm sure most of the educators on the call are quite familiar with the concept of establishing relationships before there's a problem, and creating an open line of communication. I think the other thing that's been helpful, and I may have mentioned this on our last show, but the mantra of it affects me, but it's not about me, can be so helpful for educators. I know it's helpful for me as an educator and in my personal life. this concept that there are times where our interactions with others, whether they're students or families or fellow staff, are negative in nature and they're blaming or condescending, to remember this affects me, but it's not about me. This idea that a lot of our parents are highly stressed can actually free you from feeling the need to be defensive. It frees you from having guilt or shame sometimes, and instead can redirect your energy to realize like this is a family that's really struggling. Perhaps they're struggling more than me at the moment. And this is a reflection of their own stressors rather than a reflection on me. But I think it requires a great deal of finesse on educators. It's a lot harder to do that right now. But creating lines of communication, being, almost structuring ways to develop a relationship early and often throughout the school year will allow those maybe more negative interactions to go more smoothly.
So as we finish up, fill in the blank. As we move through this pandemic as educators, I hope we all remember blank.
I hope we all remember that we are in this together, that we are on the same team. I think one of the things when you have something that's so collective like this is, one of the pros is this concept that we're in this together. But one of the negatives is that usually when we lean on others, when something happens to us, we lean on others that have emotional resources available. But right now, almost everybody is tapped out. So I hope we all remember that we're in this together, but many people are struggling and having a difficult time. And so, flexibility and adaptability is the name of the game.
Well, Dr. Eric Rossen, you have really helped us so very much, and do want to point to the National Association of School Psychologists COVID-19 Resource Center. We will include it in the show notes. I just encourage all of us to remember that we all know it's not business as usual. It's just not. But when we go through things like this for some period of time, we try to, I think, go back to our comfort zone. And right now, just giving kids and each other and ourselves extra grace, love, and kindness is just so important because it's challenging for all of us. So, Dr. Rossen, thank you so much for your encouragement, for your help, and for bringing the research to us. I know our last show has had many, many listens, and this will be helpful as well. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Millions of students across the United States are struggling with remote and distance learning. Teachers are also grappling with how to voice their concerns that come up regarding a student's health behavior, well-being, or safety at school. Today's sponsor, Impero, has a fantastic free solution called Impero Backdrop for educators and school staff to record and track these concerns. Impero Backdrop is cloud-based, and they make it easy to report concerns and see trends across your entire school or district. This helps educators support students who may be struggling emotionally or in other ways. To sign up to use Impero Backdrop for free, visit coolcatteacher.com/Impero. That's coolcatteacher.com/IMPERO. Thanks for sponsoring the show, Impero.